Ladies and gentlemen, we have not enabled the audio functionality so that we can be able to save on bandwidth. So if you have any questions, if you have any comments, please post them on the chat within the event app. Then we'll be able to answer your questions after each presenter has made their presentation. I now wish to hand over to Marine, who will introduce the IATA team, and then off we go to the first presenter. Marine, if you're available, please go ahead.
Thank you, Jafet, and good morning or good afternoon, everybody. So we are very excited that you are joining us for this Fuel Masterclass today. We will have 3 facilitators to run this workshop. Alexander Cooper, who is the Director of Fuel at IATA, based in Geneva, as well as Mark Vaughan, who is the Head of Technical Fuel Services with IATA, based in Montreal. And most of you may actually know Mark already from his time with South African Airways. And I am also part of the IATA commercial fuel team. I am based in Geneva together with Alex, and I will also be running a module today. But before we start, I will hand over to Alex for a few welcome remarks.
Thank you, Marine. And from Geneva, Switzerland, welcome to the session on behalf of IATA. I look forward to contribute to the AFRA Aviation Stakeholder Convention. Together, AFRA and IATA can add value to the aviation industry, and I strongly believe that the global and also regional expertise of IATA and the deep expertise of AFRA for African aviation matters, if we put that together, we can actually deliver value and great things for the aviation industry. So I'm really, really happy about this very good cooperation. We will look at a couple of relevant topics. Now, fuel, obviously, cost is one of them, but the restart is another one. And so we have an exciting couple of sessions here or topics which we will cover. And that's it from my side. I would like to hand back to Marine, who's going to shed some light on the content of today's session. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Alex. So next slide, please. Perfect. Okay, so when we started discussing with AFRA the opportunity of organizing a masterclass on fuel in relation to the recovery, we thought about, okay, what needs to happen on the fuel side for a smooth, safe, and sustainable restart of flight operations in Africa. And that's how we designed the content of this workshop. So really based on 3 modules. So airlines need to have fuel of the right quality that is fit for purpose, especially in this context of very low operations with smaller amounts of fuel being uplifted. So what does that mean for quality? Airlines also need fueling operations to be carried out timely when they ramp up flights in a location. And of course, the big challenge for everyone is to anticipate what is the demand going to be like in the next few months. So what does that imply for the fuel supply chain? And finally, airlines also need to have competitive fuel cost when they reactivate routes in their network. So what is the impact of the crisis on the cost of fuel? And as we know that fuel costs are rather high in Africa, we thought it would also be good to cover the basics of fuel pricing and what best practices should be. So each module will last between 10 and 15 minutes, and we will open up for questions at the end of each section. And at the end, we will wrap up and provide you with some key takeaways. Next, please. Okay, so before we start the workshop, I will just need to remind participants that we are in a competitive environment, so competition laws apply at all times. So that means that some topics and issues cannot be discussed. That include pricing, commercial strategies, bids, boycotts of any particular organization, for example. And these rules apply to the presentation and also to the Q&A session. Next, please. Okay, so the context really explains the motivation for this masterclass. And in line with what we've heard during the previous session of the AFRA convention, of course, flight numbers and the demand for aviation fuel has been very low for over a year now. In some locations in Africa, we've seen close to 80% drop in volume last year. And that has impacted, of course, the whole jet fuel supply chain. Right, everyone had to adjust and adapt their operations to this sharp decline. And most entities, of course, had to scale down their operations. But we now have the prospect of demand progressively increasing and returning as restrictions on travel start to soften in some parts of the world. So when demand does return and picks up, what does that mean for the supply of jet fuel? And how can we best prepare so that the flights that are gradually returning can be filled safely with fuel of the right quality, on time, and at competitive and fair prices? And here I'd like to move on to the next slide, which is a graph which actually shows how interdependent and integrated the fuel supply chain is. So it's complex, it involves many actors, and what they do impacts the other parts of the supply chain. And as we will see throughout this workshop, the collapse in air traffic and jet fuel demand has had an impact, of course, on everybody, right? From the refineries who have had to adjust their production and produce more of the other refined products such as gasoline and diesel and less jet fuel. It also impacts the levels of jet fuel stock around the world in storage facilities, either on airport or off airport. It has impacted the distribution networks, as well as, of course, the equipment and the manpower at the airport to refuel the aircraft. So that's why we will see that everybody really needs to work together to prepare for the restart. Next, please. Okay, and so before we start looking at all these aspects, we would actually like to start with a poll question and ask you, what is your biggest concern regarding fuel when you consider restarting flights in a location? And that question is, of course, primarily addressed to the airlines. So would it be, and I think here, Jafet, you will be able to open the polls for participants to answer the question on what is their biggest concern. Exactly, yeah.
The poll is open right now. I think we'll give the participants a minute to be able to respond, and then we'll close the poll.
Very good. So is it quality, is it supply, is it cost, or is it all of the above? Jafet, are you able to see the results? Okay, very good.
I'll be closing the poll in around 15 seconds. So we have a few more seconds to be able to give you answers. So the responses are quite good. And the poll is closed.
Okay, I'm not sure I'm able to actually see the results.
All right, I'm able to see, Marine, the results from my end. I can read them out for you. I'm seeing they have indicated supply at 33%, costs at 33%, and then A, B, and C at 34%. So quality is on 0.
Okay, but I guess, yeah, quality is also included in the last answer. So Yes. So I guess it's pretty balanced indeed, the responses we got from this group, and thanks a lot for sharing your perspective. And as we will see, we'll be touching upon all these aspects, and it's important to also know, what the challenges may be also on the quality side, so that everyone is prepared for the restart of flight operations. So I think without further delay, I will now leave the floor to my very experienced colleague, Mark Vaughan, who will take us through the module on safety and quality today. So Mark, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Maureen, and welcome to everybody, and looking forward to present on the technical aspects of the restart and quality of fuel. Next slide, please. Next slide. So I'd like to start my portion of the workshop with a poll question. So what needs to be done when an aircraft is being brought back into service after having been parked for a long period of time? Do you need to check for microbial contamination in fuel tanks? Do you need to service the aircraft in accordance with the aircraft maintenance manual? Ensure that the fuel being uplifted is on specification and fit for purpose? Or option number 4 is both 1 and 2, and option number 5 is 1, 2, and 3. Jeff, if you can tell me when it's closed.
I've just opened the poll question now. We'll equally give it a minute for responses, and then I will definitely read it out.
Perfect, thank you.
So far, Mark, I'm seeing responses that are inclined on the last one, that is 1, 2, and 3.
Oh, that's very good.
Just give it a few more seconds to see if that's gonna change. That is changing now. I'm seeing changes here. 33% on service aircraft in accordance with the aircraft maintenance manual. Let me give it a bit more time, like 10 seconds. Okay, Mark, and I close the poll. I'm seeing 25% service aircraft in accordance with aircraft maintenance manual, and 75% on 1, 2, and 3.
Excellent. Thank you for that, Japheth. So 75% of the people are absolutely right. All 3 are relevant. There might be a question, does microbial contamination really grow in, or is there microbial contamination in fuel? Yes, there is. You'll see that in my presentation as we go along. So we can go on to the next slide. Okay, so the first one, this session is going to be a little bit like speed dating, just giving you all the aspects on the restart that needs to be looked at, touching it on a high level, but there's a lot of good reading material that we're going to give to you that you can use after this. And also, of course, there's opportunity for questions at the end of my session. So the first topic that we're looking at is on airport equipment maintenance. Now, the Joint Inspection Group is one of the operational standards bodies that produce documentation that is used most around the world and very, very broadly in Africa. So but at the start of the pandemic, with operations being at the level that they were, as we've heard from Maureen, that they're at very, very low levels even today, there was a concern that facilities wouldn't be operated correctly and on specification. So the Joint Inspection Group issued a bulletin 128, placing equipment into care as part of the pandemic response and going forward. topics that were covered on in this particular bulletin were fueling facilities, fuel equipment, hydrant systems and maintenance, keeping fueling staff current. So on the fueling facilities, a fuel facility is designed to operate and not have fuel standing there with nothing being done. So daily housekeeping still needs to be done. There still needs to be things like sumping done to remove any condensed water in the bottom of the fuel tanks needs to be removed. Filtration equipment needs to be kept wet, because any filter that is dry, it becomes inoperable and not safe anymore to operate. The same with fueling equipment. Fueling equipment's got filtration on it. It also needs to be kept moist. There is guidance in there how to rotate your vehicles, your dispensers and your refuelers through the operation to keep them going. And if you place them into storage, how you place them into storage, or guidance on how to place them into storage. Hydrant systems are also designed to be used. You need to have flow through them to keep them clean, to keep, remove particulate and any condensation or moisture that builds up in them from the low points. So there's guidance on that. And then, of course, addressing staff requirements as well during the downturn in the operation and how we bring them back into operation again. Next slide. The second topic that I'd like to cover is microbial contamination. As I said in the opening with the poll question, yes, microbes do feed on fuel and they do live in fuel systems. So that is a very important aspect, especially with all the parked aircraft that we've got. Parked aircraft has fuel on board. The fuels delivered to that aircraft is dry and clean. But as the aircraft stands, you have dissolved fuel or dissolved water in the fuel. You have the vent system of the tanks that is open to the atmosphere. And as that fuel heats up in the day, and it pulls in moist, humid air into the fuel tanks. And as the temperatures fall during the evening, for instance, and night, the fuel cools down, the air cools down, and any moisture in the fuel and in the air condenses out of the fuel and the air, and this drops to the bottom of the tank because water is heavier than fuel. So airlines need to have a sumping regime, as we call it, so to remove any water from the low points of the aircraft fuel tanks, to remove the habitat that these microbes, fungi and bacteria live in, and they feed off the hydrocarbons of the fuel. So if you remove their habitat, you remove where they live. If you do not do this, there is the chance of them multiplying, and of course from them multiplying, you get biofilms forming on the tank walls of the aircraft tank and sludge forming that can eventually be picked up by the pumps and fed to the engines and clog engine filters, causing safety issues and concerns. So before putting your aircraft back into service, there's tests that need to be done on this fuel, and these are done with, in some cases, with tests with quick, or the most common is done with quick test methods. IATA has guidance material on microbial contamination in aircraft fuel tanks. You'll see at the bottom of this slide, there are 5 test methods that are recommended by IATA. 3 of them are for testing fuel, and that's important to note, and 2 of them are for testing water. So any water that you pick up. So the first 3, the highlight, the micro monitor 2, and the fuel stat resonate plus are the 3 that are used for the fuel that is taken out of these low points when testing for microbial contamination. The last 2, which is the EasyCult and the Sanai, which is a Japanese test method, comes from Japan and mainly used there, is important that is used in the water that is taken out of the fuel system. It is not suitable for the fuel that is taken out. So if you have contamination of moderate and high, then you have to proceed to treat this fuel with BioBor as per the instructions of the supplier of this product and the aircraft maintenance manual. Let's proceed to the next slide. Okay, the third aspect I'd like to cover is the inspection and the responsibilities of airline to ensure quality. So most airlines belong, or a lot of airlines belong to the international, the IATA fuel quality pool. This stems from the requirement of regulators for airlines to have oversight of the uplift of fuel and ensuring quality for their aircraft. So that came at a very high load to airlines and a high cost. And because airlines share locations where they fly to, the IATA fuel quality pool was established by airlines to share the load and the cost of these inspections. These loads and or these inspections results are put into a centralized database, and all airlines then have access to that they can adhere to their oversight requirement that is given to them by, or expected from them by their regulatory body. IFQP obviously was affected as well by the pandemic, and they put measures in place right at the start of the pandemic to keep locations current through desktop inspections. So in other words, a questionnaire was sent to fuelers or suppliers, and they needed to fill out this desktop inspection and then discussed with the inspector to try and keep things on track. Locations, inspectors are also required to do refresher training on a 2-yearly basis, and as the pandemic and the lockdown has been lengthened and carried on, there has been a requirement to put virtual training together for inspectors to keep them current. There was also measures put in place for inspectors in country to do inspections of their facilities in their own country. So for instance, Kenyan Airways has inspectors. They would have been responsible for all the locations within Kenya to conduct these inspections. And then on the other hand, there are many countries around the world that don't have inspectors. So of course, there's been a bit of a backlog built up from that, because these locations haven't been able to inspect these locations. And what's going to happen is IFQP is going to prioritize these inspections on a risk-based approach. The risk-based approach will be prioritizing as we start up airports where the risk is higher, and then lower risk airports will be done slightly later on. Next slide. Lastly, I'd like to just cover filtration. This is a topic that can be spoken to for a very long time. There is a lot of material that I've included in this presentation, so for you to look at, and you'll see that in the next slide, but let's just stay on this slide for now. And I would just like to highlight 2 things. So first of all, there is filtration into the fueling facility or into the tank farm. There's filtration out of the tank farm, and then there is filtration then into the plane, the last offense. So that will be on the refueler or on the dispenser unit. Now that is the aspect that I would like to cover over here is there. A few years ago, we had an incident with SAP being released, a ruptured filter and releasing SAP into the fuel tank, or being passed into the fuel tank, of course, making the fuel off specification. This resulted in almost a loss of the aircraft because thrust control was lost. The superabsorber polymer, and if I can just tell you what that is, it is a material that is similar, that is found also in baby diapers or nappies. It absorbs the moisture, and of course it becomes spherical and very soft and pliable. And if it gets into the fuel tank, it can cause big problems. Resulting from that, JIG released a bulletin, or actually there's a special interest group established by IATA, and this filtration needs to be removed from the system. But as we stand today, there is still some of these filters in the system, and to mitigate the risk, JIG released JIG Bulletin 105 in commissioning and also limiting DPs. DP switches were in place. And what I'd like to say to airlines today is, if you are uplifting at locations, which is very possible because there's many locations still with SAP filtration in place, please ensure that they have applied JIG Bulletin 105 or the equivalent in the US, which is the ATA Bulletin 2017 number 2. That needs to be put in place. but you have copies of this. To get more information, because of the constraint time we have, I have also included the SAP Special Interest Group summary and roadmap, which gives you a lot of background on this filtration. I'd also like to tell you that we are working on drop-in solutions for filter monitors. There is dirt defense with electronic water sensors that has already been put into standard. There's a bulletin that explains that. And then there is also currently in the field trials, there's water barrier technology, but there are definitely constraints around that technology. It works very well, but it clogs up very quickly and needs to be replaced on a regular basis or more frequent basis than we would like to have seen. So with that, you can see the documents in front of you that we are available as a download and freely available for you. And I'll open the floor to questions now.
Mark, I don't see any questions yet on my end. Please, if you do have any questions, you can quickly go to the chat box or the Q&A section in your Cvent app and then post your question there. I don't see that, Mark. If I manage to see it at the end of the presentation, most definitely will.
That's perfect, Japheth. And also, maybe there's a lot of food for thought. So
yes.
As I say, at the end of, I'll be here at all the presentations to take questions if need be. And of course, yes. The participants have got your contact details. They can get hold of you. Please send it through to me by email, and I will answer the questions after this event.
Thank you very much, Mark, for the insightful presentation.
Thank you.
Over to you, Maureen.
Thank you, Japheth. So Mark has highlighted some critical aspects related to safety and quality, and I will now take you through another aspect of fueling operations related to the readiness of the fuel supply chain. So next, please. Thank you. And okay, so let's open up this module with our last poll question of today. So we would like to ask you, and this time it's directed to both airlines and fuel suppliers, do you feel throughout this crisis that the communication between airlines and fuel suppliers on a regular basis has been lacking in some locations? And it's a simple answer, just yes or no. And that's just to really also get the pulse of this group.
Okay, the poll is open. The poll is already open. Please, participants, go ahead and you have a minute to be able to submit your answers. I can see responses are coming in. So far, they're inclining towards yes, most of them, like 2/3. I'll allow for, the results are now swapping towards no.
Ah, interesting.
Yes, so I'll give it another 15 more seconds.
Sure.
Good, Marine. I think I'll close the poll at this. We have responses here. Interestingly, it's all at 50-50.
Okay. So that's again pretty balanced, and it's good to hear because as I'll explain, some of the feedback that we have received from the industry is that communication had been lacking in some locations in parts of the world, and that included Africa. So it's good to know that sometimes there are already strong communication processes in place. And we'll still go through some of the recommendations from the industry on how to improve that regular communication. So I think we can move on to the next slide. Perfect. So during this module, we will touch upon the challenges that fuel supply chain has shared with us in view of the restart. And then we will take you through the guidance that I was mentioning just now that has been established by a wide industry group composed of about 30 different organizations. And they have developed best practices, including some specific recommendations for African markets. Next, please. Okay, and here I would like to mention quickly the Fuel Restart Coordination Group, or FRCG, which brought together airline associations such as AFRA, fuel suppliers, and into-plane service providers from each region of the world. And they got together throughout last summer to establish best practices on what needs to happen for a smooth return to service of the fuel supply chain. So the goal was really to facilitate a smooth restart when flight starts ramping up in a location and mitigate any risk of disruption. Because what was quickly realized by this group is that COVID-19 was different from the previous crisis. So when we've asked the airlines and fuel suppliers from this wide group what was keeping them up at night, this is what they have shared with us. So of course, on the airline side, forecasting demand in the next 1 to 3 months was a real headache, as well as accommodating all the short notice government restrictions on travel that would impact their schedule. From the suppliers, and that's the blue dots here on the slide, it was a challenge to really be able to plan and source the optimal amount of fuel to supply to the airlines because of the irregular demand. Also a challenge to maintain fuel quality in these new conditions, and Mark has shared some of these challenges. And on the ITP side, and you can see the yellow bubbles, and by ITP we mean into-plane service providers, so performing the refueling at the airport. For them, the challenge was that they had to let go some of their staff and put some of their equipment out of service because there was just not being used, and therefore some challenges to ramp up and be ready when demand would return. So yeah, we can move on to the next slide. And that shows what's the proposed approach from the Fuel Restart Coordination Group was to develop a guidance with a standardized approach to the flow of communication. And we will now present to you some extracts from this guidance. So we can move on to the next slide, please. So the information sharing process has been broken down into 2 main flow of communications. One going from the airlines to their fuel suppliers and to their ITPs if there is a direct relationship. Otherwise, that information flows through the supplier. And the other path of communication is from the supplier / ITP, into plane service provider, to their airline customers. And for each path, the groups looked at what type of information needs to be distributed, why, so to inform on which type of activity, when, and how. So that is the main structure that you will find in the guidance. And what was highlighted by this industry group is that it's critical that both sides really understand the needs and the challenges of the other party. For example, what needs to be communicated by the airlines to their suppliers is traffic development, right? Any increases in flights in a location so that the necessary fuel supply capacity is available. And to achieve this, both point number 1 that you see on the slide, the flight schedule, and point number 2, the fuel volume forecast are relevant. But the industry highlighted that point number 2, fuel requirements, would actually be preferred by the suppliers in the COVID-19 environment, because that would give them something in addition to the schedule. Having really the fuel volume requirements would give them something that they can readily plan with and work with. And that same information that goes to the supplier should be cascaded down to the into-plane service provider so that they can have the necessary resources in place at the airport to carry out refueling. And one airline of the group actually shared with us that during the crisis last summer, they were experiencing some delays in one of their stations in Europe where it had not happened before. So they looked at the root of the problem, the cause of the problem, and it was actually coming from the ITP, who had not received the information in a timely manner that all these additional flights were actually coming their way. So that's the what and the why. Then when should that information be distributed? During the initial restart phase where there is very limited visibility, the industry recommended that it should be provided 1 month in advance. And as stability returns in the industry, and that can be, you know, after a consistent increase in flights over a 3 month period, then the forward volumes should be communicated 2 to 3 months in advance. But here it's important to note, and that is actually highlighted in the guidance, that those timelines may not necessarily work for some markets in Africa, where suppliers need longer lead time to be able to import and procure fuel into the country if there is no refining capacity in the country. So we will have a slide dedicated to the African markets in a moment, but that is the general guidance. And the preferred form of communication would be an email from the airline fuel department with the schedule and the fuel volume information in an Excel format. So we can move on to the next slide now, and we're going to see that, of course, everything is very much in a dynamic mode with lots of last-minute changes to the schedule, and that affects mostly refueling operations at the airport. So in order to help the into-plane service provider plan adequately and best manage their manpower and their equipment, the airlines are encouraged to actually communicate any update to the schedule, including the aircraft type information, because that can have an impact, of course, for the ITP. And the ITP is encouraged to check the airport flight information system to monitor daily changes to the schedule. And for Africa, it was actually highlighted that airline station managers may also be consulted for the latest information and updates and trends as well. Next slide, please. So now let's look at the other side of the communication flow with the information coming in from the supplier / the ITP to the airline customers. So if suppliers feel that they are stretched and they are facing any logistical issue to secure enough product to meet the demand at the airport, then they should immediately inform the airlines so that everyone can, you know, put a plan in place, and especially if it's in a more remote airport. So that's very important. And on manpower restrictions, the ITP should also communicate if they have any issues, you know, bringing back staff and getting the staff ready and the equipment ready to be able to carry out refueling on time. So these are critical information as well that should be communicated to the airline so that they can plan accordingly. And next slide. And of course, a subject that is close to every airline's heart is quality compliance. And as Mark highlighted, most airports are not running at capacity with lots of idling fuel. So any issues that the suppliers have identified that may impact the quality of fuel should, of course, be communicated. And the airlines can also request an update when they restart services in a location. Next, please. So that was the general guidance that has been established, but we also had a regional group working specifically on Africa, Middle East, and they provided these recommendations for the African markets. So fuel stocks are typically high, therefore no problem was envisaged in the short term, but it's important that the fuel supply chain actually communicates on how long the existing levels of stock would last. And again, it very much varies from one market to another, as you know. But what was really highlighted for Africa is that when demand does start picking up, additional efforts may be required to ensure that supply is available because of the longer nomination lead time to import and bring fuel into the countries that do not have their own refining capacity. So if it's a coastal location that is importing fuel by ship, it can be, the lead time can be 1 month. But if it's an inland import, and if you think,
sorry to interrupt, I can see we have 15 minutes on our timer, so we'll try to hurry up. Okay, thank you.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, thanks for the reminder.
Right.
So that is what we wanted to really highlight for Africa, that everyone should also be aware of the longer nomination lead times and the specificity of each of the supply chain locally. And maybe the next 2 slides, we can go very quickly. It's just to mention that you will find in the guidance some other information sources as well that you may want to consult to help with planning and forecasting. And on the last slide, you will see the link to the guidance. So please download the guidance and start using it, especially if you have not already implemented some of the processes that we have described. And now, Jafet, I can open up for some questions from the audience. Oh, I think I can actually see them. So one of the questions is, are we receiving a copy of the PowerPoint presentation? Yes, you will. And we've included the links on all the handouts, all the IATA resources, industry resources. So you'll be able to download your own copy. And then I see that there is another question about pros and cons of installing underground fuel hydrants for a not so busy airport, and how. So this is, of course, a very important topic. It's not strictly linked to the topic that we are covering today. So what we suggest is that we will follow up separately on this question, because we do have some recommendation. In terms of the size of the airport and whether it would make sense or not to have a hydrant system, but that is a different topic. And I think that's any other questions, Jafet, that may be coming in?
I think, Marine, that is all I can also see on my end.
Okay, so then I think just being mindful of time, I guess we can move to the module on costs with Alex now.
Okay, thank you very much, Maureen. And I will be covering the cost part of the fuel-related issues. But before we start, Jafet, can you just give me an estimate how much time I have left?
You have, Alex, you have approximately 13 minutes. I don't know whether you can manage in 10, and then we'll see whether we have any questions for the three.
Let me try to do 10, and
all right.
I'll go quickly. Maybe I jumped some stuff. Let's see. Okay, let's get started.
All right.
So next slide, please. Right. So I think what we all know is that fuel, of course, is a huge part of the fuel bill. It's actually $188 billion was spent on fuel in 2019. So basically in the last normal year that we had, that obviously went down in the pandemic because there was less fuel consumption. Now, what is important to know, because when I go to my boss and he says, hey, 188 billion, how about you save 10%? That is not that easy, because a big part of the 188 billion is actually the fuel price, which we won't be able to influence. So that's the crude oil price that is difficult to influence for any airline or IATA for that matter. Obviously, it's being set at the market. It's highly liquid. So it is basically dependent on a couple of factors I'm going to be talking about later. But it is almost a quarter of the airline costs. And can I have the next slide, please? And therefore, as you can see, fuel is actually the biggest chunk in that pie chart by far. And depending, of course, whether you have a country with high labor cost or low labor cost, the part that fuel takes in your total cost is going to be different. But it is, in any case, on average, worldwide, a very big chunk. So let us go to the next slide, and we can see that you know, what can we expect? So that there are so the global industrial production after the pandemic. So basically, starting in May 2020, a year ago, the industrial production started to go up again. And with that, with a little delay, the jet fuel price and the oil price also started to go up. This is, of course, not good news because the airlines are still very much in a crisis mode. And we will see that the airline recovery is actually has a big delay. So it's only starting now. And that depends very much on the region. So China, I understand the domestic fuel consumption or the fuel consumption for domestic flights in China is higher than 2019 already year to date. Also, we're seeing big volumes in the US because travel is coming back. But there are other parts of the world that are very much impacted still by the pandemic and where the recovery will take another while. And the fuel price goes up, so all the same, right? You still have to pay more money for your fuel, which of course doesn't help for your economic recovery. Now, let us take a step back and please, if I can have the next slide. I was referring to the crude price and just, I apologize if you already know this, but maybe some of the participants won't. So what you have is what we call market crudes. So these are the crudes that really determine the price worldwide. So Brent is a field in the North Sea. You've heard of this before. Western Texas Intermediate, you've heard of this before too. That's the marker kind of crude that sets the price for the rest of the world. And even if you would have fuel from Africa, for example, you have Bonny Light from Nigeria, you would still, that will be correlated in one way or another, both to Brent and to Western Texas Intermediate. So that is basically the price is being set by different factors. And can I have the next slide, please? And by those market crudes. Now, whether the fuel price goes up or not is very difficult to predict. If we could, we'd probably be millionaires, but of course, nobody knows where it's going. What we can say that there are certain factors that would influence the price, such as the demand, obviously, whether OPEC is cutting the production, whether there is political influence, for instance, with Iran and the US. So that all will have an influence on the price, is yet very difficult to predict. And therefore, it's also very difficult to hedge fuel, especially now where airlines struggle to get credit lines with the banks. And also, you don't know how much fuel you will hedge for because you don't know how much fuel you will be consuming. So it's very, very tricky, the situation right now. Can I have the next slides? I'm going to be very short on this one. So basically, the prices of oil are being quoted by reporting agencies. The most famous of them being Platts, but there's also OPIS and Argus and General Index. So there are a couple of them. And what they do is they basically report trades and they say, well, today a ton of jet in Rotterdam costs this much. And this is the basis for the price that the airlines then use and pay. Next one, please. As I said, the part that we can influence, and that's the part on the left, right? So there is the price that's basically pegged to the oil price, which is the Jet A1 price. There's not much we can do about that. But of course, what we can negotiate is the logistics, the fueling service, the interplane, and the taxes and fees. They have a big impact on the price that we end up paying. The next one, please. So there are different ways how you pay for your fuel. And this is a global survey that we've done. It's not accurate at all. So it might be different in every region, but it gives you an idea. So most fuel prices that we have worldwide would be based on a spot market quotation, which means that is the price reporting agencies that I've shown you before. And then there is a differential which you negotiate. That's the main component of negotiation. And then you have fees and taxes. You also have monopoly prices where you would have an oil company in a country that has a monopoly, and you need to buy of them. So there's not split up in anything. You just need to pay whatever they say. It tends to be a bit more expensive than a free market with competition. Or you have government price, or ex-refinery price, where basically the refinery sets the price. I'm not going to go into much detail because you only have a few minutes left. Maybe at the end, what I want to cover is a couple of positions that IATA has, because we believe fuel costs should be competitive and transparent. Yes, please, next slide. And the next one, please. So a couple of points I'm going to make, because I think I have only like 3 minutes or so. So a couple of points I'm going to make is, we believe the price of fuel should be transparent. And the people that set the price for the fuel should be independent, which is basically, that's why we prefer to have fuel prices based on Platts or on Argus, so on international, transparent, and independent quotations. You have that in quite a few countries in Africa, but also you have quite a few countries in Africa that would have prices that would be set by the government or monopolies or ex-refinery prices. Now, we think more transparency leads to lower prices, and therefore, as IATA, this is what we prefer. Next one, please. The second one, and you can download all the papers when we send you the presentation, is that we, of course, think that competition leads to a fair, transparent, and prices that are acceptable for the airlines. So there should be open markets. If the fuel supplier wants to supply fuel, he should be able to get access to the airport. That is not the case in many airports in the world, but it's something that we advocate for at IATA. Next one, please. So I'm going very high level here. I'm sorry for that. But if you have questions, of course, you can always go back to me. Fuel infrastructure fees. So basically the fees for using the fuel infrastructure, the hydrant system, or the tanks at the airport, they have gone up quite sharply in the pandemic because the volume goes down. But there's not a lot of cost you can cut because you still need to move the fuel. You still need to transport it or move it, store it. So there's not a lot of cost you can reduce. And therefore, with the lower volume, the unit fee has been going up quite sharply. We have developed a concept and a paper and have made proposals how you can cut the cost in the fuel infrastructure so that the unit fee increase won't be too big and it won't harm the recovery. Next one, please. Now, this for me is one of the biggest items we will see. And I'm not sure about Africa, but certainly in Europe and the US, we're seeing a huge discussion about the environment. There is a big mainstream, I would say the majority of the population in Europe and in the US favor higher taxes for pollution, for CO2 emissions. And as you know, fuel for international flights cannot be taxed in accordance with the Chicago Convention of 1944 and the ICAO rules. I know it happens in one country or another, but it's really not allowed according to the international law and the treaties. However, there's a lot of push from many countries to implement taxes on fuel because they think it will help the environment. Now, we don't think so, but that's a push that is coming, and we will see a push for introducing new fuel taxes. That is going to damage aviation quite badly, because if one country introduces it, then people will just take the hop to the next country and take the long haul flight from there, which can be very, very damaging to the national economy and to the airline of a particular country where such fuel taxes are introduced. We strongly advocate against it. I think it will be one of the biggest problems in the coming years. And again, we've got a paper on this. You can read it. There's more detail. I'm happy to discuss. And then finally, we are on the next slide, please. And that's, I think, just about the last one. We are, of course, also looking at concession fees. At some airports, the concession fees are very high. We think there should not be a fee levied by an airport authority just for the opportunity to make business in a certain place. We think that fees should be cost related. So basically it could be rent, it could be for using a certain part of land or electricity. That is okay. But really to just say, okay, if you want to do business on my airport, you need to pay a lot of money, which is the case in some airports in the world, we think is not the right approach. In fact, in Europe, this has been abolished. So you cannot ask for a concession fee in the sense that you get paid for giving someone the opportunity to do business on your airport. But I know it's a case in many airports. I will also say that every country is different and we need to look at each individual case, because in some cases the fee might be justified, but it's just called concession fee. But in many cases, it will not be cost related, it will not be transparent. And that's something that IATA is advocating for, to ensure that airlines have transparent and level playing field when it comes to costs. So I know this has been a very, very quick run through the cost sessions. I apologize for that. And I have a question here. And I think it's from Mark. So let's go with the Q&A session. Next slide, please. And then everybody can ask questions to everyone. We're happy to answer those. So Mark and Maureen, if you want to come on.
Thank you very much. Thank you very, very much, Alex. I know we are only having a few seconds to go. The platform is quite restrictive on the time, and sorry for the sprint. We have made you really work on your slides, but what I will do, I'll quickly see if we don't have any time to answer the questions. I can quickly send them through and then you'll be able to respond when time allows.
Yes.
Because I see clearly we are out of time, and I really want to thank the participants. Along with the presentation, probably I'll be sharing the summaries, that is the takeaways of this very interactive session, along with the presentations, I think at the end, mostly because of the restriction of time. But I really want to thank you most sincerely for preparing and putting this together. It's a really, really insightful discussion.
Thank you very much, Jafet, on behalf of IATA and Maureen and Mark for the opportunity to speak in your event. And we look forward to working together with you in the future.
All right. Thank you. Thank you very much, all.
Thank you.
Thank you and bye-bye.
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 Goodbye.